Singularity.
Hello everyone, my name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity One-on-One. Singularity One-on-One is a regular podcast feature of Singularity weblog, where you can go and listen to it or download it in full. If you guys enjoy the show, you can support it and help me make it better in a couple of ways. One of them is to simply go and write a review on iTunes. You can also click the like button on YouTube, or you can simply make a donation. Without further ado, let me jump in and introduce our hot pursuit or a hot follow-up interview with Peter Voss. Peter Voss is an entrepreneur, inventor, engineer, scientist, and an AI researcher. Or I should correct that, and I should say one of the very few AGI researchers, and that's a big difference, I think. So this is only one among many reasons that he's very unique, and I'm incredibly happy to have him back on the show. So welcome again, Peter.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Fantastic. So we had a sort of a decent sort of general discussion last time, but we never actually had the chance to go in a little bit further into depth of many of the issues that we barely managed to touch upon. Now, I do have 3 or 4 favorite topics of mine that I want to jump in, but let me start by asking you, what do you think we should focus and talk a little bit more on, something that we didn't have the chance to do last time?
Well, I think we covered a broad spectrum of issues last time, and as you say, we sort of touched on them lightly. There was a lot of ground we covered, so I'm happy to pursue whatever you want to. Your viewers have an interest in. Though you may have, if you want to get into deep philosophical debate on particular issues, you may have prepared for it more than I have. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, I admit I am partial towards philosophy and ethics in particular, but I wouldn't say I have prepared substantially for this, other than I have given it some thought. And okay, and this is only actually one of 4 or 5 things that I want to discuss today. So let's just jump right into it and see where it takes us. So the sooner we get it out of the way, the sooner we can move on to other things. So here's my greatest concern from the things that we talked about last time, and that's basically the coupling between intelligence and morality. The claim that you make quite often that higher intelligence leads to more ethical or moral decisions. So lead us through that process, because last time we didn't have any chance for you to unpack it. Lead us through that process and show us how that would be the case. I mean, you did give us the case of the Iraqi war, or the second Gulf War, the Iraq invasion, but give us some more meat here.
Right. So I guess one of the simplest ways to get into that is to kind of turn it around and say, why do people often, if we look at what most of us would regard as immoral behavior, and of course that's a whole another issue to say, how do we determine that? And I'm not sure that we're going to have time to go into it, but clearly there's some things that there's a lot of common ground, and most people would agree that something is immoral. So if we just take those clearer cases where there is agreement, and you analyze why people do that, and I think in many cases a very, very significant percentage of immoral behavior is caused by lack of knowledge, or emotional or fear response, or let's call it more generally an emotional response, such as pushing buttons, religiously, or relationship-wise, or ego, sort of the whole spectrum of emotional responses. And then, as I say, lack of knowledge, or lack of consideration, thinking through the consequences. So maybe there are 3 categories, sort of the emotional response, lack of knowledge, and lack of thought. And my simple argument is that better intelligence basically mitigates all three of those to some significant extent. And I'm certainly not claiming that it can in all cases overcome that. I mean, I've certainly had experience having religious debates within Mensa, and there's some people who debated me under the carpet on religious things, and I mean they were just so good in practice at that, and they were so good at deluding themselves that it would have taken more skill and patience than I possessed to go through that. Now, quite frankly, I was impressed with the skill, the debating skills,
Mm-hmm.
and so that would be an example of where an incredibly patient AI would go through and say, all right, let's just stop here and see, you just slipped one by me, in terms of going from a premise to a conclusion, or you introduced a weird premise, and let's just spend the next 3 days talking about that particular item and then see if you still agree. But having said that, yes, I think people have a great capacity for deluding themselves. So I'm not saying that a rational agent will in all cases be able to overcome that. But the other thing I mentioned in our previous talk was that if you have a trusted agent, and I think that's a big part of it, and I mentioned that in the Gulf War in respect to that, if we already had a trusted advisor who's given us good advice previously, where we wanted to do one particular action and it explained to us why that might not be give us the desired outcome, and gives us a better suggestion, and we follow that suggestion, and it leads to a good outcome. So if we have a trusted advisor of an AI, we are more likely to listen to it. I mean, the same as with humans, and we are likely to be able to change people's minds for them to act more rationally and with more foresight. And that's really the sort of the simple story of how I believe, how I'm confident that people will act more morally.
I think I have a small agreement with you here in the sense that I do believe that more knowledge would help us make better decisions. However, I want to stay away from equating more knowledge with intelligence necessarily. And as far as, say, the second Gulf War example goes, the US did not have an AI advisor, but it had many other very good advisors. For example, the government of Canada, which is one of the closest allies of the United States, and we have traditionally supported the US 90% of the time. The only exceptions have been the Vietnam War and the second Gulf War, that is the invasion of Iraq. In both of those cases, we see clearly that Canada was right. And especially when it comes to the second Gulf War, the whole world came up with an endless supply of rational arguments why that shouldn't be happening. And yet, the people in charge and the population was kind of beaten up into a fervor of patriotism that basically had an overwhelming support.
Yeah, sure. But I'm not sure how that undermines my case. I mean, we don't have a rational advisor that people trust, and we're not in that mode. I mean, it's basically one person's emotion versus another person's emotion right now. And the decision making, I mean, you will grant that in terms of public opinion and so on, has very little to do with fact and rationality.
Absolutely, but the policy recommendations from Canada and infinite other places were very rationally argumented. Anyway, but let me try and say it in a different way then. So I would give you 3 reasons why I do not buy your argument, right? The first one is personal or subjective experience that I'll bring. The second is historical, and the third is theoretical. So subjectively or personally, here's my experience and when I stopped judging people on intelligence. I was 18 years old, and I was conscripted into the Bulgarian army forces against my will. Basically, the choice is you either go to jail or you go to the army. And for a number of reasons, I was sent into a punishment unit, where pretty much it's the law of the jungle. It's survival of the fittest, more or less. And this was one place where I wasn't even sure if I'm going to make it the first couple of weeks. So I actually slept a few nights with a loaded AK-47. But one thing that I learned very quickly there is that my previous sort of habit or presumption that I should be judging people based on their intelligence is absolutely false and actually could get you killed. Because what I noticed is that it's not necessarily the most intelligent or smartest people that end up doing the right thing. In most cases, I saw people who have pretty much as low IQ as you can possibly imagine, who were willing to sacrifice themselves or who were willing to step up and make the ethically right decision. So for me, that was the first sort of subjective sort of observation of the decoupling between intelligence and ethics. But let me give you why this is actually apparent when you do a historical review, right? I mean, look at that issue historically. Take any case that you want. For example, Einstein. Einstein was absolutely shocked by how quickly the smartest of his colleagues in Germany embraced World War I and jumped in it with a fervent patriotism that absolutely dismayed him. Right? Those were some of the smartest people in the world, and yet they made very poor ethical choices when it comes to the war. And I can give you endless other examples of that. Your own homeland, South Africa, right? The apartheid regime. There were a lot of amazingly brilliant people part of that regime, supporting that regime, brilliant scientists in endless disciplines. I mean, South Africa had, scientifically speaking, very impressive accomplishments during the apartheid period. And yet, most of those people never stopped to actually question that and were happy to be part of it. So historically speaking, and even if you look at the business community, take, for example, Enron, WorldCom, Lehman Brothers, like McKinsey used to test those people in Enron all the time. They were some of the, quote, smartest people coming from the best, smartest Wharton School of Business, etc., etc. And they prided themselves for being the smartest people in the world, highest IQ, broadest knowledge, etc. Complete disregard for ethics and morality, right? Or the effects of their actions, right? So I think, to me personally, historically, it's almost a truism apparent throughout history that there's complete decoupling. I mean, take Martin Heidegger, brilliant guy in so many ways, member of the Nazi Party, never apologized for his support of Nazism, right? One of the smartest people of the 20th century. I mean, this was one of the reasons why Sigmund Freud kind of was totally ended up totally condemning our whole civilization and wrote a whole book about that, right? And finally, if you look at it from a theoretical perspective, I would say this. Your argument is sort of an economic cost-benefit analysis. A smarter rational agent would weigh carefully the cost and the benefits of the action and would therefore likely see that a moral action would give him greater benefit than costs. And that's why a higher cost action, like, for example, invading Iraq, would not be undertaken. But I would say morality for me, and ethics in particular, is precisely doing the right thing when it doesn't pay for you to do that. Precisely when, under a rational, economically based analysis, you shouldn't be doing that. And I would say that's when you stand up for principle, and that's when you're willing to sacrifice, in some cases when I was in the army, your life for what's right or for what's wrong. And if you're basing that on a rational analysis, especially self-referring to yourself, chances are you'd never undertake any such actions. Anyway, that's so much for my rant. So let me see how we can confront that.
All right. Well, you certainly gave it a good rant there. So yeah, as I said, you probably have prepared more to give me a barrage of
I've thought
arguments
about it.
against that, and so there are a couple of things, and I don't know, you covered a lot of ground, so it's hard to remember all of the different points that you made, but just because smart people did immoral things, well, dumb people did immoral things too. So I don't know, you kind of intimated that you know,
But then
not so smart,
intelligence is not
not so smart people are likely to be more moral. You always try to
no.
turn that upside down, you know.
No, absolutely not. I didn't mean to say that stupider
Yeah,
people
and
are.
so let's look at historical evidence. I mean, in terms of knowledge and thinking and rationality, we are certainly seeing a decline of religions, which I see as part of the intelligence. Now, when you talk about human intelligence, of course, it's only one dimension of a human. You know, I mean, the sort of sidekick of that is EQ, but more broadly speaking, just generally the emotional profile of a person. And it is true that very smart people are actually very, very good at rationalizing things. And that's sort of a downfall of smart people, why smart people can, once they get into a certain ideology, they can rationalize better. Now, I'm talking about machine intelligence here, which, you know, decouples a lot of the primal emotions that we have, the, you know, the survival-based emotions, I guess we could call them, and basically help people overcome where the emotions are really driving it and not their rationality. Because I think the examples that you're giving, to a large extent, I would say it's not the intelligence that made them. It's in spite of their intelligence. It's intelligence that basically rationalized their emotional behavior. So I guess I'm talking about a different type of intelligence than human intelligence. So therefore, I would say your argument does not quite work out that way in saying, you know, smarter people are less likely to be moral, or are just as unlikely, or just as likely to be moral. So what I'm saying is machine intelligence that doesn't have those basic instincts driving it will help us reason through things. And I don't think we have this is a place for us to go down that particular path, but I do want to just mention that I think we have a difference in our understanding of what morality is. You talk a lot about self-sacrifice and doing things that are against your interest as being moral. Those are not primary things that I consider as moral. I think there's a somewhat different starting point we have on what ethics is. So, you know, where your focus seems to be on self-sacrifice and doing things that are not in your interest, I see that as a very minor component of morality. My main focus of morality is based on rational self-interest, and where in fact the actions you take are in your interest and are in society's interest as well. If you know, maybe we can discuss it in some detail. But before we do, I would really ask, or anybody else who wants to debate, is to read a rather lengthy article I have on my website. If you Google just rational ethics and Peter Voss, you'll get straight to it. I did spend probably several years actually pursuing that, so it is also a very strong interest of mine. And as
I'll link to it definitely.
And it's very interesting in discussions one has about, you know, politics. One very quickly finds out if you don't agree on what ethical foundations you have, you don't get very far talking politics. And when you have ethical discussions, you find out if you don't agree on epistemology, on how we know anything, then you don't get very far in agreeing on ethics. And epistemology, in turn, is based on you know, metaphysics of what actually exists, and one really has to sort of work through the foundations in any meaningful philosophical debate, because you know, if there's disagreement on the more fundamental issues, you're really just going to keep talking past each other.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with you to the extent that our starting premises may be a little bit different. And I agree about the importance of epistemology and metaphysics and how that impacts on ethics inevitably. However, I would say my take is not necessarily that to say that self-sacrifice is necessarily a good or a moral thing. I was just giving it as an example in which and there are many examples. So let me give you another one. Let's say I accept to 2/3 of a degree, or 2/3 of the way, your response to my first two criticism out of the three that I listed before, right? So the personal and the historical one, you responded, I think, pretty well, with the fact that you are actually referring to machine intelligence, right? So therefore not human intelligence, and therefore hopefully we will be able to avoid or escape those other things that make us also human, that actually make us or subvert our rationality, and
Right.
despite of it make us undertake highly immoral action. So let's look at the third issue, though, which is the theoretical issue, and where I claim that and I think you still haven't addressed that with respect to machine intelligence and how it's going to help us in a situation in which the cost benefit analysis is against the ethical outcome. So in some cases, as I've said, it would be simply easier to exterminate the people, and that would lead to sort of ruthless efficiency, and sort of the shortest distance from point A to point B, which is your starting point on your goal achievement. If you do not take into consideration other ethical things, which are not necessarily pliable to a cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, I would argue that ethics is not deontological at all. So that basically you would be doing the right things. You wouldn't be murdering people because you would come to the conclusion that it's not in your interest. And I just want to make sort of one, again, my essay goes into a lot of that, but I just do want to make one clarification here, is that I do very much believe in principled behavior. And the reason for that is we are, even with the smartest AI, there are a lot of uncertainties in the world. There are a lot of decisions you need to make with incomplete information. You don't have enough time for it. And that is why principles are so important. And that, for example, lying. And, I kind of very quickly, you'll come up with a counterexample where you need to lie to people. And I obviously totally agree with that.
No, I will not, actually. I will
Oh,
not.
okay. Well,
I'm a Kantian.
Usually,
with respect to that, I'm a complete Kantian. I think one shouldn't lie.
Right. Well, actually, I think there are absolutely situations where you should lie, but then it's a higher principle that would override that. But if you basically philosophically come to the conclusion that lying is not actually in your interest by and large, all things being equal, and you internalize it, you basically acquire the virtue or the habit of not lying, then in the long run, that will be to your interest. And it's basically those virtues that you embody, that you automatize, that help you act in a certain way. And I think this is what guides morality. Now, our moral compass can go very wrong, and it's extremely difficult to change emotionally based behavior. I mean, I think we all know that, deeply ingrained beliefs or behaviors are extremely difficult for us to change. On the other hand, you mentioned South Africa, and I was utterly surprised and amazed how quickly, if I can call it, white South Africa changed its mind about apartheid. I mean, there was a real, as people got exposed to, traveling overseas a lot more and getting external views, people who were deeply entrenched and had bought into apartheid, who were raised in it, within just a few years, very large percentage of people actually really realized that it was immoral. And I didn't experience in America how it played out here, but I certainly did experience in South Africa that there was a sort of a tipping point where people's minds really were changed.
But why are you getting surprised by things like that is what I'm trying to figure out. I mean, you said last time that you were surprised by how people in the United States got so feverishly patriotic and stupidly supportive. I mean, that's stupidly is my word, but in support of
I'll,
the Iraqi
I'll
invasion.
buy that. Yes.
And to me, I mean, if you look at it historically, there's nothing surprising about that. I mean, it's the same happened in Germany, which Berlin was like the center of civilization before World War One, and it happened almost overnight, and it dismayed and shocked Albert Einstein. The same happened in
Right.
endless other examples where people, now it's happening in Ukraine, for example, between Russian Ukrainians or people who prefer to speak Russian and Ukrainians. It's happening, and it's happened in Rwanda between Tutsis and Hutu overnight almost. Like, we know that this thing happened. So, and the fact is that as it happens in a good way, which was the post-apartheid South
Right.
Africa, it can happen also in a bad way.
Right. But I think we're also both on the same page that things are getting better. I mean, I think that we probably are of the same mind that, civilization is improving. And I would basically, my argument would be that an AI that we can actually trust, that's useful, that has common sense, that has understanding, that understands human emotion, can help us think these things through and make better suggestions, will basically help accelerate that process. So maybe I don't need to put it any stronger than that way. I'm certainly not claiming that having a human level or superhuman level AI will guarantee that everything comes out roses. I'm not making that claim. I'm saying, though, there is a very strong tendency towards that, and maybe leave it at that.
Now, let's say that I give you 100% the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that I accept your argument. Now, leave me the next step. So, is there not the possibility that we may actually not be able to either rationally comprehend the argument put forward to us by the AI, or simply we might not be able to overcome our humanity, as it were, emotions and evolutionary baggage and so on, in order to embrace the proposed course of action coming from the AI?
Well, really what we're still talking about is, are we going to be in a better world? Are we going to be better off with AI than without it? And, does it guarantee that AI will be able to, talk enough sense to us that we don't do anything immoral? Well, probably not, I'm sure there will be outliers. So really, I'm just saying, is it likely to be beneficial? And I would say strongly, yes, it is. So yeah, is it going to convince every person? No, probably not. And but it'll make more good information available to more people.
My take on it personally is that it may hopefully be necessary, but I don't think it will be sufficient to make that change.
Well, it depends what you're expecting as an outcome. I mean, if the claim I'm making here really is no more that it will be a very strong positive influence. It's like having millions of really wise, smart teachers, Einsteins or whatever, whoever your favorite character is, that you wish there were more people like it around, and that everybody can have their own personal moral agent who can talk sense to them.
I have a few favorites, like Gandhi. Like, by the way, Socrates, who argued very much in support of what you've been arguing since the beginning, that, a rational individual always benefits from being rational and from not lying and from telling the truth, etc., etc. Anyway, I think it's time for us to move on and talk about something else. So let me give you a couple of quotes that I pulled out from our previous interviews that were absolutely fascinating, and I want you to help us unpack them. So the first one is this quote. You said this in our previous interview. To me, free will is a solved problem. End of quote.
Okay. Yes. And
doesn't it deserve a little bit more?
Well, the fact that philosophers have been debating about this for thousands of years, and very smart people are still in disagreement over it right now, clearly, it would indicate that it's not something, I'm not going to say one or two sentences that'll be a knockdown argument for everyone. Actually, the neatest comeback that I had to a very smart person, I discussed it with many years ago, and I spent half an hour discussing my whole point of view, and then sort of what do you think, and he said, "Sir, I don't have a need for that hypothesis, free will, so." Which I think is one neat way of actually dealing with it, is just saying, let's just forget about it. It's like the God hypothesis. No, I don't have a need for the
Yeah,
free will.
Occam's razor.
Yeah. Now, having said that, of course, I do argue that compatibilism, my position is a compatibilist position. So I do believe there is a meaningful concept of free will. So the concept of free will understood correctly is a valid, meaningful, useful concept. So I do have a need for that hypothesis, if you want to put it that way. I think it is useful. Though I sometimes doubt in debate whether I'd be better off calling myself a determinist and then giving a completely different word to what people describe or experience as free will. In fact, I sort of compromised a little bit. I don't know if that was a good idea or not. Again, I have a lengthy essay online as well on compatibilism, and I actually call it free will as a single word, free will as one word, to kind of distinguish it from free will, the traditional thing. So I think the concept of free will needs to be understood, of what is it actually in reality that gives rise to that concept. And I think once one understands what that is, it actually is compatible with determinism. But one also has to understand what you mean by determinism. Determinism, I think, we now know not to be a sort of simple billiard ball cause and effect that you can calculate and basically everything is predestined in any meaningful way. So we now understand that part of modern determinism, it includes quantum mechanics, includes chaos theory. So we know inherently that the future is not predictable. Not for lack of knowledge, but inherently, that it's inherently not predictable.
That thought drove Einstein crazy.
Yes, but we kind of know that now. So by putting those two things together, saying, yes, determinism properly understood, and what it is in our psychology, in our ability, in our intelligence, that allows us to take responsibility for our actions in some meaningful way. That is the part that I call free will. The two are compatible. So, animals, certainly lower animals, without getting into the debate of, exactly how to cut it off or gray areas, do not have free will. They do not know what they're doing. We know what we're doing, and that is kind of the big difference. And so, yeah, so in my sense, yes, the free will is a solved problem.
Mm-hmm. There's many things I want to talk about there, and I'm weighing that. But also on the other end, the last thing you said kind of like really kind of surprised me, because it again goes against my personal observations whether animals do know what they're doing. So for example,
Yeah.
my wife has a Yorkshire Terrier,
Mm-hmm.
and she's a very pretentious, very suspicious little thing, which it was the first test that I had to pass, because she doesn't like anybody, and the moment I walked in the house for the first time ever, she absolutely loved me. So that was like very
Mm-hmm.
fortunate for me. But when she does something bad, she knows it, and she goes and hides,
Right.
and she feels guilty,
Mm-hmm.
and she behaves guilty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Right.
she comes and she sort of tries to sort of
Yeah.
soften you up,
Mm-hmm.
apologize, if you will.
Yeah. Again, I would urge you, if we want to have a deeper discussion on that, to sort of read my essay on it, and one could zero in on where exactly the differences are. It's clearly, especially high level mammals and I mean dogs are specifically bred to push our emotional buttons and to communicate with us and all of that. So it wouldn't be surprising that you would sort of see behavior that correlates strongly with human behavior in dogs.
Very good point. But yesterday, for example, there was a a run out of a bunch of apes from a zoo. I don't know if
Right.
it was in Chicago or somewhere, and
Right.
where the instigator, as it was called,
Right.
found a tool or a ladder
Mhm.
that basically he put near the fence and sort of was the first to jump and sort of call all the other apes to
Right.
follow him,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
12 of them managed to escape.
Yeah, it's a very interesting field to study animal intelligence,
Yeah.
and just where the boundaries are and the borders are. And there are surprises on both ends. There are surprises of how much there is, how that there is somebody at home in certain respects, and how little somebody is at home in other
Yeah.
respects. And
Yeah.
so it's clearly not, a black and white thing that, there is sort of a single free will thing, but it is very much related to intelligence and the ability to form abstract concepts, and particularly the self concept, so that we are aware of the fact that we are an acting entity in some meaningful way. We are the instigators of chains of actions, causal chains, and in that way we can take responsibility for those actions.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, not true to any significant extent in animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
So just for the record, for those of us who may not have yet read your paper,
mhm.
do you believe that we have free will or not?
Well,
Again,
as
it's
I
very important to get the meaning of your words, as you said,
yeah,
what free will is and
yeah.
what
Well,
determinism is.
as I said at the beginning of this section, that I've gone through phases where I've said I'd be better off saying there is no such thing as free will, but there's something else that is similar to free will, but we'll give it a different name. So there is a very significant and important ability that humans have, cognitive ability that humans have, that I think is reasonably described by the concept of free will. But if people get their knickers in a knot and really want to, if it's easier to communicate with somebody by saying, okay, I'll agree we don't have free will. Let's put that aside and we can move on. There's certainly, I don't believe there's something as the traditionally understood free will of being acausal, the kind of free will that's in competition to determinism. So quite clearly, I do believe that, and maybe that cuts through it quicker than anything else, is that a digital computer can have free will. I have no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
So that kind of cuts through the argument. I mean, I'm not even relying on quantum uncertainty or anything weird and wonderful.
So how can you unpack this? How can, say, my digital computer have free
No,
will?
yours can't.
Okay, which one, which is not a quantum computer but a normal von Neumann machine, can have free will?
Well, one that has human level intelligence, basically AGI. Once we get to AGI, and that, I don't know if that's going to be your next question about consciousness, because that's my other controversial
Absolutely, you guessed
question.
it. That's exactly the sort of.
But to me, AGI reaching human level intelligence automatically implies that it will have free will of the kind that are described. And it also automatically implies that it will have consciousness, will be aware of itself as a thinking entity.
Mm-hmm. So I got two. You sort of totally guessed the direction that I was trying to steer you in, and my evil plan was, of course, to talk to you afterwards about two other quotes that I pulled from our previous interviews, and one goes like this. Again, consciousness, that's a quote. Consciousness, that's a solved problem. And the other one is, quote, the primacy of consciousness has to be garbage. End of quote.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you please unpack those for us?
Okay, so let's do the epistemology one first, or metaphysics ontology. Consciousness means being aware of something, so there has to be a consciousness that exists. So basically self-refuting to say that consciousness has to exist, so existence has to come before consciousness. Now, what we know of reality and how well we know reality is a whole nother debate. I mean, how directly we know we don't perceive reality directly, we perceive it through our senses.
Mm-hmm.
But consciousness means being aware of something. So things have to exist, and existence is, is primary. So I'm not sure that I need to say more about that. Again, philosophers have argued about that for millennia, and it's not going to be something I'm going to put people at ease, but or convince people, in a few sentences here. But it's basically anybody who says, well, there's a primacy of consciousness, that basically I'm just imagining things, well, I basically stop talking to them if they really want to persist in that, because then they're just imagining having the discussion with me. So they're not really having a discussion. So let them just go and dream on, They don't really need me for it.
Okay, but some of us are actually interested to find out, because I'm open-minded. I especially when it comes to, like, let's say I'm a little bit more inflexible when it comes to ethics, but when it comes to free will, when it comes to consciousness, I am kind of more embracing of the beginner's mind. So I'm totally willing to consider and embrace your point of view.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that's probably as much as I can say without repeating myself on consciousness. That it's basically self-refuting, that believing that there's a primacy of consciousness. And as far as machines go, saying it's a solved problem, it depends on what part of the problem one is addressing. I think there are a lot of computer scientists and people who are into AGI or just high-level AI, who are reasonably happy to say that a machine can be aware of itself and so on, and they don't have a problem with that. So usually to those people, what it comes down to is what they call the hard problem, and that's basically qualia.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much I mentioned last time about that, but I think it's essentially a problem that the philosophers have created for themselves.
David Chalmers, perhaps, in particular.
Yeah, well, it came before him, but yes, I think he tied it very nicely into a huge knot that people find. I find it absolutely amazing that they now have the 20th. There's just been the 20th year of towards the science of consciousness in Tucson. I was actually at the second conference 19 years ago, and I think I went to 2 subsequent ones, and it was just absolutely amazing. I mean, there were these most brilliant people in the world. There were about 1,000 people attending. Have you ever been to one of them?
No, but I almost went, and I was actually originally invited to moderate one of the sessions this year.
Yeah.
But then Dr. Stuart Kameroff kind of changed his mind or forgot about it or whatever happened. So it turns out I'm not going. Okay. It's only going to be in about 10 days from now, right? On April 21st.
No, I didn't keep track of whether it's already happened.
It's going to be in 10 days from now. And I actually went and I interviewed in person Stuart Kameroff, specifically on consciousness and on quantum consciousness.
Right. So I found it really fascinating. So you have 1,000 people attending, and you have 100 speakers or something with parallel tracks. I mean, it was really a big affair. And speaker after speaker gets up on stage, and these are people basically studying consciousness, and the conference is called Towards a Science of Consciousness. And speaker after speaker gets up on stage, and usually the first thing they say is, "We really have no idea what consciousness is." And then they spend another 40 minutes giving their opinion about consciousness. I find that really weird. Now, of course, there are some scientists who have made it their career to try and unpack consciousness. I like Marvin Minsky's description of consciousness being a suitcase word. It's basically lots of different things that somebody just threw in a suitcase, and then put the label consciousness on it.
Do you know Adam Watts' definition of consciousness?
I don't think I remember that now.
Let me see if I can remember the exact words. Chronic muscle tension, if I remember it correctly.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's a new one to me. Anyway, so, it really is surprising to me that there is so much of a debate, but it just shows the confusion of what people are actually talking about. I mean, I find sort of a simple way, and again, this is not going to satisfy anybody quickly. It's a difficult, controversial topic. Is if you just use the word awareness, it kind of helps already to take some of the sting or some of the mysticism out of it. And basically, people have awareness, and how people differ from animals, certainly lower animals, is that we have an awareness of ourselves and our thought processes. Whereas animals would bite their tail off if it didn't hurt them, but they don't really have a good concept of where their body starts or ends, and they're not much less aware of any thought processes, emotions, or so on that they can take into reasoning. So we have the introspection. So we are aware of ourselves as a thinking entity, as a physical entity. We are aware of our emotions to some extent. We are aware of our thought process to some extent. That's what consciousness is. And the qualia thing, the hard problem of consciousness, is basically just, as I say, philosophers tying themselves into a knot. And sort of the quick answer is that you have what's it like to be a bat, or what's it like to see red. Basically, the problem is it's an experience that we have, which we are trying to describe in terms of some other experience that we share with the listener. So, if I was asked, well, what's it like to be a woman? Or somebody tried to explain to me what it's like to be a woman. Well, how do you describe that? So you describe it in terms of some other common experiences that you have, and depending on where the person is coming from, you may succeed in that. But, it's not some ultimate mystery of qualia. There's this qualia of womanhood or manhood or whatever. Yeah, sure, you can't pin it down, exactly and describe it. So you can only explain it to somebody in terms of shared experience. So if you never come across a woman, you grew up in some, I don't know, place where they, where they took boys and raised them separately from women, yeah, you would have no reference point to describe it. And that's really the whole thing that qualia is about. It's nothing more than that. Is you're trying to describe the experience of seeing red or green or whatever it is you're trying to describe in qualia in terms of something else. And, that's just very limited. And that's all. That's all there's to it. End of story. Uh-huh. And if an AI has sense organs and had a very complex emotional experience related to sensing things, basically, if the senses were intertwined and triggered lots of different states, then one robot could say to another robot, well, what's it like to touch a hot plate? Well, it depends on your sense organs and how you wire it up. So it's just like touching it with your foot, except it's on your hand. Or whatever. If there is some common experience, you can explain it. If there isn't common experience, then you really struggle.
Mm-hmm. Very good points there, Peter. Unfortunately, time is advancing again. So let me ask you this, kind of concluding our conversation. We've talked today for about 45 or 50 minutes about 3 issues this time, and that allowed us to get a little bit more into depth. So do you think there's any value in that, whether with respect to our previous conversation that gravitated more with respect to artificial general intelligence, or in general, even beyond that? Is there any benefit to philosophizing about those topics?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a great fan of philosophy and discussion and debate. And I've certainly learned a lot listening to other people. It is, however, extremely, extremely difficult because people need to have the motivation and the openness. They need to be in a place in their lives to be interested and motivated and open to a particular topic, a particular point of view. So it's a very ineffective and inefficient way of doing it, but I absolutely think it's worthwhile. And I actually have arranged several discussion groups and salons over the last 30 years, in fact, with many different people and all sorts of topics, from has marriage outlived its usefulness to qualia, and philosophy, politics, and so on. So absolutely, I think it's, but it's extremely difficult to make it productive.
Yeah, you see, when you say stuff like that, makes me feel so regretful that I live in the other end of the continent, because I would have loved, absolutely loved, to be able to join you in some of those discussions. It would have been absolutely a blast, I think. Anyway, so I still, I'll be leaving today with the thought that perhaps we'll have that opportunity one day sooner rather than later.
All right. Well, if you're at the AGI conference in August, I will be there. So we could meet in person there.
Well, let me leave it at this. I hope that I will be there. We're currently talking with Hank about that, and I think he may have already spoken to you about it, or will soon.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about Ben Goetzel's AGI conference in Canada.
In Quebec City.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. I was looking at that recently, but I was unimpressed by the organization and the sort of the slowness of the logistics and the details and the speakers and the program. I don't know. Are you among the organizers? Did I just criticize you badly?
No, I'm not at all. And in fact, I didn't even look at the program. I'm not really interested in the program. It's just catching up with people there. So
yeah, but I can't even see who are most of the people who are going there, because they're not listed.
Yeah, I think they're still trying to put that together.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm dying to be there personally. So I hope to meet you there. Right. Anyway, let me ask you this: what are your parting thoughts today? How do you want to close this today?
Oh, I need to give words of wisdom again.
Of course.
Twice in a row. Okay,
I get you here to put you on the hot seat. I mean, this is not just a walk in the park. I mean.
Okay. Well, I tell you, my mind is very, very much focused on building AGI. I'm in the middle of that. I think there's nothing more exciting or more important to do, and I believe it can happen in a relatively short time, less than 10 years. And I'm working very hard at that. So anybody who's interested in that, let's talk. Let's make this happen.
Fantastic, Peter. And on my part, I want to just say that it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on my show. I do wish you all the very best and good luck towards your goal. I will definitely sort of watch you as it were, because unfortunately I'm not one of those people like you who would make it happen, but I'm one of those people who are very interested in the implications. And so I wish you good luck, and we'll all be, just like my audience, we'll be watching you, and probably we'll get together again soon.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks for the second interview, and that was fun.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I think the pleasure was mine.